Hey everybody, let's talk about the Phillips curve today. Unfortunately, there will be no cheesy Mr. Clifford intro music in this video. Okay, so the Phillips curve describes the inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. Remember that and you'll be one step closer to passing the AP exam. Before we kick things off, who first discovered the Phillips curve, guys? Thank you, Ronan and Jonathan. If you said Bill Phillips, you would be right. A jack of all trades, Bill was, at different times in his life, a crocodile hunter, electrical engineer, and prisoner of war. What a maniac, or rather, a moniac. That one was for you, Ishwar. He was a Keynesian economist who studied 100 years' worth of British economic data and discovered that there was an inverse relationship between wage rate and unemployment levels. This discovery was later extended from just the wage rate to price level and inflation in general. This inverse relationship is shown in the graph over here. At times of low employment, there is high inflation, and at times of low unemployment, there is high inflation, and at times of high unemployment, there's low inflation. We know that with monetary policy and fiscal policy, the government can control the inflation rate. Thus, the Phillips curve implies that politicians can choose to accept slightly higher inflation rate in return for lower unemployment, which would be a point right about there, which is something that the Keynesians would have sought. And in the short run, they can do so. However, in the long run, people build expectations of future inflation or deflation into their actions. For example, if a worker knows that inflation will occur, they will ask for higher wages. Then, the employer will likely cooperate because they know that in the future they will have to pay high wages regardless, and they know that they will earn more because of a higher price level due to the inflation in the future. This means that unemployment will not be affected in the long run by different levels of inflation, as people are aware of the future changes. Thus, there is a second component to the Phillips curve, the long-run Phillips curve, which is a vertical line. As it's a vertical line, the long-run Phillips curve shows no trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Milton Friedman and Edmund Phelps first proposed this curve in the 1970s, when stagflation was occurring. Stagflation is a state of both high unemployment and high inflation, which cannot be explained by the then working model of the short-run Phillips curve. Thus, we know that the long-run Phillips curve is vertical. The rate of unemployment that the long-run Phillips curve, that I'm going to call the LRPC from now on, sits at is called the NIRU, or non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. If unemployment is pushed below this rate, then inflation will keep accelerating as people build the inflation into their expectations. The NIRU is positioned at the same place as the NRU, or the natural rate of unemployment, at around 4 to 6%. Because the movements and shifts of the Phillips curve are tied in heavily with aggregate supply and aggregate demand graphs. The natural rate of unemployment, by the way, is the unemployment that is necessary in any economy, that is the sum of structural and frictional unemployment. You all know the raw pain of forgetting one little arrow on a graph quiz. Hopefully, after I go over this next section on the movements and shifts of the Phillips curve, you'll never lose another point. The general rule is, changes in aggregate demand cause a movement along the SRPC, and changes in aggregate supply cause the SRPC to shift up or down. If demand increases, thereby creating an inflationary gap, there is a movement to the left along the SRPC. This is known as demand pull inflation. You'll notice that I pulled these graphs right from our study material for the graph quizzes. Now, if demand decreases, shifts to the left, as shown here, creating a recessionary gap, there's a movement to the right along the SRPC. This is the depressed economy graph. There is less inflation and more unemployment in this case. Shifts in supply also cause the SRPC to have a change, this time a shift instead of just movement. If supply shifts to the right, the SRPC shifts downwards, because if there's more things that are being supplied, there will be less unemployment. If there is at every level of inflation. If there is a negative supply shock, which is shown here, which can occur when one good critical to the economy, like oil, becomes more expensive, the SRPC shifts upward. This is known as cost-push inflation. The name makes sense because the cost of one good causes suppliers to have to charge more for their goods, thereby pushing the cost onto all of the consumers. Thus, the SRPC shifts upward because for every level of inflation, there is more unemployment. Now, let's review everything one more time. The SRPC describes the inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. The LRPC declares that there is no trade-off between unemployment and inflation, and that there is just a vertical relationship between the two. Demand and supply are shifters of the SRPC, or cause movement. A change in demand causes movement along the SRPC, and a change in supply causes the SRPC to shift upwards or downwards depending on the kind of supply shock. Just use logical sense and you should be good with everything covered on the Phillips curve on the exam. Thank you for watching. Click like and subscribe below and buy my extra packet. I'm just kidding, I'm not Mr. Clifford. Thank you.